So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this private screening of Oppenheimer. I am Andreas Persbo. I'm the executive director of the Open Nuclear Network, which is a program of the One Earth Future Foundation in Denver. And I am part of the organizing crowd today, together with our sister organization, PAX Sapiens. Before we begin, we will have a short panel, and I would like to welcome in particular three eminent speakers, some of whom I know, some I don't. And they are policy shapers, and they are the next generation as well. First, and she needs no introduction, joining us today is President Mary Robinson, chair of the Elders Group of Former World Leaders. She is an Irish politician, a lawyer, a diplomat, and she served as the President of Ireland from 1990 to 1997, being the first woman to hold that post. So welcome, Mary.
Thank you.
Joining me also is Mr. Shashank Joshi. He asked me to be brief in introducing him, and just simply say that he is the Economist's defense editor. Welcome, Shashank.
Thank you.
And finally, I am joined by Marcela Capaja from the School of International Futures. She is the creative lead and network weaver at the school. She was awarded the Next Generation Foresight Practitioner Security and Technology Special Award in 2021. She is also a Future Generations Global Ambassador at the Office of Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. So welcome to you as well, Marcela. So, Mary, let's begin with you. Back in 2020, you were present at the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists' decision to move the symbolic doomsday clock closer to midnight. Mm-hmm. During that event, you described having the reaction of an angry granny, which I very much liked. And you passionately called on the world to wake up to the dangers we face. Fast forward to today, to 2023, and President Biden has expressed that nuclear threats are now at their most severe since the Cuban Missile Crisis. In light of this alarming situation, is it reasonable to suggest that the world remains complacent? Could the film we are screening today play a role in shaking us awake?
Well, quite honestly, reasonable is not a word I would use. It's actually scandalous, the situation in which we find ourselves. The threat is much higher. Indeed, since that time when we went in 2020, I was there again this year, and we moved that bit nearer to midnight. I mean, it's really very frightening and very worrying. And I did march as a young woman against the bomb, as we called it then. And where are the young now? I hope, Marcela, you and I can confer on this, but where are the other voices? There's so much money spent on nuclear weapons, on now refurbishing, making them more faster, which means more dangerous, hypersonic, etc., and also with higher technology. We need, once again, a more human approach, like we see in climate. I've just come from a conference in Kigali in Rwanda on climate and other issues related to gender equality. And there was a great focus there, but the word nuclear didn't appear. I mean, it just wasn't on the agenda. And I think that's a problem, because we should have diverse voices. We should have global South voices. So no, I don't like the word reasonable. I think we actually need to get active, and I hope that this film that we will see, that I've seen clips of and I'm looking forward to, will be a wake-up call for all of us.
Some people say, or I say anyway, that it might be the Dr. Strangelove of our generation. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I do. And I hope it'll be as popular as the Dr. Strangelove film, in the sense that it did hit the spot at the time. And I think, from what I'm hearing, but I haven't seen the whole film, I think the dilemmas and the concerns at that time were very real, especially for Robert Oppenheimer himself. But my God, it's so much worse now, and we've been led to be somehow accustomed to the fact that we need a nuclear deterrent of this huge, enormous, unbelievable size and worry. And so I do think we need to take stock, use this as a wake-up call to a much better approach, which the elders have put forward. We have, once again, we've looked at our nuclear policy and reissued a revised version of it today, and I can tell you more about it later, perhaps.
Thank you. I mean, yeah. Mary said, it's so much worse now. And I would like to turn to you, Shashank. You follow these issues daily as the Economist defense editor. And I'm quite eager to hear your analysis of the main threats that we're facing today, the main nuclear threats that we're facing today. From your perspective, what are the most pressing challenges? What are the most concerning scenarios that pose threats to us? And is it, as Mary says, so much worse now?
Thanks, Andreas. How many hours do I have?
About 2.
Okay, great. So, I mean, the dial is clearly moving, and there's a sense that this is a very febrile, unstable moment across the nuclear order. And just very briefly, to catalogue some of these, we have Iran's nuclear program accelerating, accumulating higher enriched uranium at remarkable amounts that were supposed to be foreclosed under the nuclear deal. Just a week ago, we had a North Korean nuclear test, and in calmer times, the news that North Korea was maturing the capability to strike the US, continental United States, with a nuclear weapon would be front page news, and now it's sort of item 6 or 7 on the list of these crises. And of course, we have a different sort of nuclear threat at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which has been heavily militarized. But the thing that has dominated the past 17 months has, of course, been Ukraine. And Ukraine has concentrated our minds for a couple of reasons. One of them being that Russia has used nuclear weapons as a shield behind which to prosecute its conventional aggression in Ukraine. And then it has also used repeated nuclear threats in ways that some people think begin to erode the nuclear taboo of the last 70, 80 years and normalize nuclear weapons. But what I just wanted to say before I stop is that I'm struck by the parallel conversations we have on this. And you talked about, Mary's a wake-up call and the hope this would inspire other activists. I was at the NATO summit in Lithuania last week, and yes, these nuclear threats are a wake-up call, but in a completely different way. I watched as Lithuanians, Poles, other Eastern Europeans stood up and said to American senators, I was chairing a panel, said, when are you going to put nuclear weapons in Poland? We want these now. I thought Ukrainian MPs stand up and talk about the importance of deterrence. The final communique at the summit said NATO is a nuclear alliance, took note of the decision to put nuclear weapons into Belarus and effectively strengthened that aspect of NATO policy because they saw the correct response as being a need to shore up deterrence. And I'm not weighing in on that debate myself here. I'm just pointing out how interesting it is that we have these parallel debates and how rarely they connect with each other.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting going back to Stanley Kubrick and Dr. Strangelove, but at those days there were only 5 powers when he wrote that film, and now we're up to 9.
That's right, and you look indeed, you know, for Kubrick's age, this was a US-Soviet problem, and the debate in the US, for those who follow the nuclear policy debate in America, many of you do, of course, is China's arsenal, which is growing at a phenomenal pace. And you have voices in the United States who ask, does this mean we need to be able to survive a nuclear strike from both Russia and China and therefore need a far greater arsenal than the one at present? And all of this is unfolding, of course, as you all know, most of you know, that US-Russia arms control is collapsing in a very dangerous way.
So to go back to what Mary said, threw down the gauntlet, so to speak, is it worse now than 1960?
What I think gives me pause in saying, it's tempting to say it's worse, but of course, you know, those of you with experience and perspective and a sense of history will also know what the nuclear weapons situation was like at key junctures in the Cold War. In '62, when we had nuclear torpedoes on Soviet subs that were, then debates occurred as to whether they should be used. In the Able Archer crisis in 1983, when NATO exercise caused genuine consternation in the Soviet Union that a nuclear strike might be planned. And of course, we had nuclear weapons in far greater quantities and heterogeneity than we do today. We had nuclear torpedoes, nuclear air defense weapons, nuclear landmines, nuclear artillery, stuff that we look at today, and it does look Strange-Lovian because it is so absurd. And of course, numbers are down, variety is down. NATO has a tiny number of tactical nuclear weapons in Europe. Russia has more, but we seems to me we've got to keep a sense of perspective and not assume, not play down the severity of the problem in the Cold War just because we feel nervous today.
Right, that's a very important point, very valuable. It's very interesting to look backwards, but I also think we should look forwards a little bit. So for you, Marcela, you are deeply involved in thinking about the future. It is kind of what you do. It's your daily life, so to speak. And as a future-focused practitioner, what value do we have in looking at historical figures and historical events as we are going to see today? What is the value of that for someone like you? How can films and storytelling about historical figures like Oppenheimer shape our collective understanding of the issues that we've just heard are almost philosophical in nature? And importantly, how can we use these films to engage those of us who are much younger than myself and Mary, more your age, and will take up this gauntlet for the future? How can we shape the narrative today?
Thank you, Andreas, for the kind introduction, but also for having me on the panel. It's an absolute honour to be here with such amazing panellists and such an incredible crowd gathered around this critical issue. I'd like to first set the scene for the perspective that I bring to the panel today, because I address you not as a decision maker or an expert in nuclear security, but rather as a future generations global ambassador, only one of the many voices, and as a next generation Foresight practitioner, which, despite common misconceptions, is not about predicting the future. I'm not sitting there with a crystal ball trying to figure out what is going to happen, but it is about looking at the plausible eventualities and exploring those what ifs and asking those questions. So I'll start by examining that future focused perspective, which is so valuable in the context of a film like this around a historical figure such as Oppenheimer, because it not only helps us to reflect on the past, but it also highlights the importance of looking ahead and to the future, to not only look at what threats might emerge, but also at the opportunities that we have. The field I work in is in part born from thinking around nuclear risk ahead, and figures like Herman Kahn contemplating mutually assured destruction, exploring alternative scenarios, and thinking through the unthinkable. So as we look back at the story of Oppenheimer as Christopher Nolan tells it today, it serves as a reminder that our decisions do have consequences, not just for today, but for the future. And it highlights the importance of thinking through those implications in the future, asking the what if questions, exploring those various alternatives, and taking a longer term view, which is embedded in the decisions we make, in the institutions that we work in, and in the frameworks and regulations that we continue to build. And as seen time and time again, those decisions have far-reaching consequences and hold implications for future generations. So in the time that has passed since Oppenheimer, things have both changed, but also some things just have not. And we have experienced dynamic shifts in the security sector, seen technology advances, seen our risks morphed, but the conversations have remained the same and have remained with the same people. So that brings me to my second point around the power of storytelling, which film and cinema leverages. We all have that friend who, when they tell a story, you hang on to every single word they say until the end. I'm clearly not one of those if you haven't figured that out yet. But it is a powerful tool to communicate complexity and open conversations on complex issues such as nuclear security. But it's not only to engage with future generations or younger generations, but actually anyone who isn't in the room. And it distributes that thinking globally, beyond the sector, across boundaries, institutional silos. And that's so important with an issue that's so interconnected as nuclear security. And if we as a global community are to transition to a safer, non-nuclear world, well, we cannot go about it ourselves. We need to bring in those other perspectives, those other viewpoints from other sectors, climate to peace building and beyond. And together with tools like Foresight and storytelling, develop that collective understanding of the present and future security challenges. And by opening that conversation to be more inclusive, we can hear those new voices, diverse perspectives, and include those who historically just have not been part of the conversation. We can start to build coalitions of the willing by bringing together the intergenerational actors, diverse perspectives from different geographies and backgrounds. Because let's not forget that the next generation today, they are going to be the leaders of tomorrow. So that has been a key learning from our network and the Changemakers program, which has kindly been sponsored by and funded by the Ploughshares Fund. And really it's one of the key principles that led me to where I am today. Having worked in international institutions such as Interpol and NATO and hosted Foresight discussions in the sector, I've met incredible individuals working on these issues and looking at the future of nuclear and global security and coming at it from different angles, different perspectives, with different organisational views and incredibly valuable insights, but they rarely get the opportunity to look at these things together and think about them collectively with their various perspectives. So our network is the space to do that and think about the present and the future, celebrate those diverse perspectives. And it has so far been met with excitement and fruitful discussion. Some of you may have attended the IAEA Safeguard Symposium last year in November, where we unveiled what futures thinking and storytelling and diverse perspectives can achieve through presenting futures experiential rooms, which, much like cinema, can help to immerse you in future possible worlds. And through scents and sounds, helped us to really provoke thinking on the future of nuclear safeguards and what that might mean for our work in the future, perhaps from a perspective that has not previously been considered. So before I hand back to you, Andreas, it's worth noting, as Mary said, that this may well be a moment for renewal and interest in the field, not just nuclear security, but also around considerations around the wider existential risk. And this is something that we've been leveraging at the School of International Futures, growing our community with over 600 practitioners representing more than 90 countries, and opening that space on climate change, on intergenerational fairness, existential risk, and technology. And using this as an opportunity to open that discussion to the next generation, raise awareness, prepare and mobilize. But it really puts into perspective on how we think and how we might rethink how we educate next generations and future generations around complex issues. And whether through cinema or film or otherwise, let's do that intentionally. So how can we normalize diversity in these conversations rather than making it an exception? So diverse voices can be heard and those perspectives can come in. And to make this not just a conversation captured by a narrow minority of interested parties, but a truly global conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcela. I mean, you mentioned a few things here. I think it's very important. You said it's not just about future leaders, it's about bringing anyone into this discussion that is not in the room. You also mentioned Herman Kahn and his book, Thinking the Unthinkable. And it reminded me that when Chris Nolan pitched this film to his own family, his son said, "Why, Dad? No one cares about these issues anymore." Is it fair to say that we kind of forgot to think the unthinkable? Have we forgotten our muscle memory? Do we need to come back to that?
I guess I'm a little bit biased because I do this on a day-to-day, thinking about the unthinkable and using the tools that we have in our toolkit in order to do that. So I would certainly hope that with this movie we see a resurgence of interest and an interest in actually using those tools to help us think through those unthinkable things and embedding that within how we do our thinking, how we make our decisions today, and how we live our lives, and building those anticipatory mindsets in the work that we do.
Thank you. I mean, it's a rare moment in time when art and reality kind of comes together in a single year. I'd like to turn to all of you for this one. And I would like to go back to the director of the day, Christopher Nolan. He was asked in an interview if he would have pressed the button himself. It's a loaded question in many ways. And his response was very interesting and kind of goes into what you said a little bit, Shashank. He said, he spoke quite long, this was for the Telegraph, and I don't know if you're in the room, I think you might be. He spoke about language of probabilities, right, and probabilistic thinking, ethical paradoxes, practical realities of theory. Sounds very Nolan for those of you who have followed his work. And he talked about thought experiments about weighing risk in everyday life and so on and so forth. I'd like to turn to all three of you. How do you yourself view these ethical complexities? We've started to kind of dig into them a little bit, surrounding the very existence of nuclear weapons and its potential use. Is it clear cut? I mean, can you actually say, you know, yes, there's a simple answer to this? Or was Chris Nolan right to be ambivalent in his interview with the Telegraph? Who wants to go first? Should I perhaps go back to you? Okay. Mary. Yeah.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. Really interesting question. I really liked listening to what Marcela said, because it gives me some hope that there is this kind of network and art, you know, making the link with art and thinking about different futures. But actually, nuclear weapons do pose a host of serious moral and ethical complexities. And this is why it's important to have a political course of action to focus on practical, deliverable choices that reduce the nuclear risk and make it less likely that anyone will ever be faced with the appalling choice of whether to use them or not. And we are getting closer to this being talked about, which is the really frightening thing. And the only guarantee for non-user of nuclear weapons is their complete abolition. And this must be the ultimate goal. And the elders do support the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW. We're pleased that it has now come into force, and we hope that nuclear states will in fact link with it, that it won't be a kind of divide, and that there'll be more of an interaction between the nuclear powers and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. But actually, we recognize that nuclear weapon states aren't likely to give up their weapons anytime soon, so we have come forward with what we call the nuclear risk minimization agenda. We call it the 4 Ds, and it's more practical and more likely to engage. And indeed, we've talked to some nuclear countries about this. First of all, the first D is doctrine, that all nuclear states should make a clear no first use declaration, or at a very minimum, declare that the sole purpose of nuclear weapons is for deterrence. Secondly, de-alerting. As many warheads as possible, if not all, should be taken off high alert status. There are far, far too many on high alert status. Deployment. The numbers of actively deployed warheads should be significantly reduced. And finally, decreased numbers. The numbers of warheads in existence should be dramatically reduced. They were reduced from a very much bigger earlier number, but still we feel that they should be reduced to the US and Russia having no more than, say, 500 warheads, and China, which is, as you say, busy building up its arsenal, should not go above that and should not try to be more powerful in that area. So we feel, and we have had some discussion with nuclear states on this, that this is the language they will listen to, at least in the shorter term. But I come back to my conviction, especially with AI, with the possibilities of an accident or a technical fault or whatever, that we are in great danger. I was in Kyiv. They're worried there about the nuclear site. I've read a lot about maybe that is not as serious as we think it is, but we're living in a very complex world now with many crises, and it worries me that the nuclear one is not getting the attention, which is why I want to link afterwards with Marcela, because the elders are very keen to broaden this into a much broader discussion with many more voices in the room to really understand that this is profoundly, for all of us, an ethical and moral issue, because our world is at risk because of the build-up and the kind of renewal of and the effect of the Ukraine war, which you rightly said. Right. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Andreas.
I was going to turn to you, but I kind of need to turn to you.
Thanks, Andreas. Yeah, I mean, I'm so in the early, late in the Cold War, the U.S. and Soviet Union agreed the declaration that a nuclear war must not be fought and cannot be won, and it was seen as a very important moment that marked the change in nuclear attitudes of that era. And in the last 18 months ago, before the war in Ukraine, we saw the P5, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, all of whom are nuclear states, repeat the declaration. And of course, the value of that was eroded by Russia's nuclear rhetoric shortly afterwards. But of course, the paradox of nuclear weapons, which was evident from very early on, from Oppenheimer's days immediately, was that to be able to conduct effective deterrence, you might need to be able to credibly threaten the use of nuclear weapons. And the way that that paradox has been wrestled with, and or if not resolved over the years, fascinates me. And sometimes that's been through devolving responsibility. In the Cold War, we had tactical nuclear weapons where responsibility for use was sometimes devolved down to lower levels, whether that was the NATO commanders in Europe or lower level artillery. And we see that elements of that today discussed around Pakistan's nuclear program in South Asia. The other one was nuclear submarines, where you had a means of nuclear delivery where communication might not always be guaranteed. And so in the UK system, the Prime Minister, as most of you know, writes a letter to go into the safe of a ballistic missile submarine and may pre-delegate that choice. They may have to commit in advance. But my favorite sort of way of wrestling with this is the famous suggestion that a US president, in order to be able to get the nuclear codes, they should be embedded in the chest of an aide who he has to kill with a knife personally to extract the codes before he can use them. And of course, the point of that is to try and force the clarity of the paradox that nuclear war does involve mass murder and mass annihilation, and yet when confronted with the act of having to kill an individual, we somehow shirk from that and we squirm at that. And it's designed to force you to confront that and think about that, which I think is useful whether or not you favour abolition, whether or not you favour ongoing continued nuclear deterrence. It's a useful, I think, kind of cognitive approach.
Yeah, it kind of makes me want to see McNamara's film again, The Fog of War, because he raises these questions and he struggled with them personally, obviously. Again, I kind of sometimes feel we have lost we have lost the advice of our elders, and we've lost our muscle memory in thinking about this.
But those who've had to wrestle with the question have always understood it. And when you go back to looking at the testimony of British prime ministers and asked would they have pressed the button, some say yes, but others say they're genuinely not sure. And it's something they couldn't or wouldn't admit in their time in office. But the ambiguity and the contradictions are always there, particularly on those who face the biggest responsibility of decision making.
Yeah. Marcela?
It's incredibly interesting to hear the perspectives on the panel, and I couldn't agree more. As I've already spoken to the consequences our decisions have for future generations, I think that in itself highlights some of the ethical complexities that we should be considering and bearing in mind, particularly when it comes to existence and potential use of such devastating weapons and the impact of that. However, what I would add from a Foresight point of view, one of the things that we constantly think about in Futures in Foresight and as practitioners are the different potential scenarios. And whilst we seek to explore the implications for the long term, that too isn't always as clear cut as we would like. And it becomes even less so when considering the interconnectedness of the nuclear field and existential risk, which is much more cross-sectoral and ambiguous. There was during the lunch earlier today a conversation around whether we are becoming desensitized to this issue. And perhaps that's a challenge that we should explore further and consider the ethical complexities around that. Thank you.
No, thank you. I do think we're getting desensitized to it, and I also feel that somehow we forget about the scale of these things. what you will see on screen today is, I think, the equivalent of about 60 tons of high explosives, which is less than 0.5% of the actual weapon that was detonated over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I understand that the imagery you are to see are both terrifying and beautiful at the same time. We have forgotten those lessons, I believe, and it's time to relearn that muscle memory in a way. And also, Mary, I think, it's, when it comes to doctrine, sometimes it feels like we're going in separate directions. Last year, North Korea promulgated a new nuclear law, which doesn't talk about, it's not a doctrinal shift for the better. They're talking about the use of these weapons for tactical purposes. How do we do, how, in your view, how do we deal with that kind of split? We are now 9 nuclear powers, not 5, and they have different ambitions and different thoughts about how to use these weapons.
Oops, sorry. Well, as I said, I do feel that the 4Ds doctrine is, very useful, and we had the P5 agreeing, as you say, what is it, only 18 months or only 2 years ago. We need to engage. Russia and the United States, despite the war, need to be talking on this issue, despite the war. I mean, it should not stop a conversation about restart. The start, and there needs to be a discussion between China and the United States on this. It's really important, and I think we need to increase the pressure of the right kind to move in the right direction. I am very proud of Ireland's history on the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Ireland was the first country to sign it because we had put forward so many of the resolutions. We were leading on it. So a small country with a small moral voice can lead. And I think we need moral voices, and we need young voices to really, bring us to a sense, why are we focusing on spending so much money on perfecting what will destroy us? Because we've been lucky, I think, up to now. I mean, I've read some of the books that you mentioned as well. I mean, we have escaped disaster because we haven't had that accident that we could have had. We now are in a situation where they're hypersonic, and there are more of them. North Korea's firing more frequently, and its law has changed, as you said. So we need to really engage in, how we come to terms with the fact that this is a real threat. The elders, we regard it as an existential threat that we need to have not only more discussion on, but actually more concerted multilateral consensus on, that we move, and we believe the 4Ds help because they're practical and doable, and they would reduce the risk, and that's our objective.
Yeah, it's almost like, I guess, what Kubrick would have said, we need to learn to live with the bomb, in a way, before we can get rid of the bomb. Any other thoughts? Yeah, Shashank.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. I just wanted to say one thing, which is that in preparation for this, I was reading an old essay by Oppenheimer he wrote in 1948 on, he favoured international control of nuclear weapons, and he was sympathetic to world government. But what is striking is that even as that was in 1948 he wrote that essay, the Cold War was intensifying and ramping up. And the arms control breakthroughs that we did see subsequently over the Cold War were almost always in times of détente or reducing international tension. I can't think of very substantial arms control or diplomatic breakthroughs that occurred in periods where the geopolitical environment was as antagonistic and tense and fractious as it is today, particularly between the US and Russia and the US and China. So whilst I also like the idea of more dialogue between these countries, I see very little grounds for optimism on that front, and history doesn't bear out that we're going to get much of it.
I really don't want to end the panel on that note. So you came to the rescue, Marcela. Fantastic, thank you.
I don't know if it's to the rescue or not, Andreas.
Oh
I'm
dear.
sorry if this doesn't lift your spirits. What I would say is that nuclear security and global security generally has been often criticized for being dominated by traditional actors who are making the decisions. So my question is, how do we challenge that, and how do we bring in those future generations' perspective? And could that help us move away from the current status quo? And how do we do that successfully? How do we move from this being an excuse for armament rather than disarmament, which I know is also a concern around this movie and this resurgence of interest?
Thank you, Marcela. I think this movie will be about choices and the choices he made, and the struggle that he faced for the choices he did. So
I was recently, sorry.
Yeah, I need to. I've had the signal to close.
Yeah, okay.
So 30 seconds.
Okay, all right.
All right?
Yeah, I was going to say, I was recently in Hiroshima for the second time. I went there as president in the 90s, and I went back just before the G7 because I was glad they were having it as their place. And when you go there, you really have a sense of how devastating it was. And now it's a peaceful place, and it's green, and it's celebrating peace and harmony, etc. We have to move forward. I wanted to end up on a hopeful note for you.
Yeah, and I am so grateful to you, Mary, for doing that, and also making me think about trees and birds. So anyway, thank you, panelists. This is time to thank the panel and end the broadcast. For those of you who have joined online, thank you for watching. So a few words of thanks before we move on to the screening. As I mentioned, today's screening is funded by our sister foundation, PAX Sapiens, with additional support from the elders. If you are staying for drinks afterwards, and I do hope you do, and because I do suspect there will be a lot to discuss, and people do say that this is a deeply upsetting film. The reception will be hosted by Mr. Larry McFall, who is the executive director of the one of our partners at Wonders Future, Vertic. We also could not have accomplished this, and I really do mean this, without the immense help of colleagues at the European Leadership Network, the Royal United Services Institute, and the School of International Futures. This has been a great collaboration by all of you, and I'm incredibly grateful myself, and I believe I speak on behalf of both our foundations to just thank you for all you have done to bring us all together. Also, we have greetings from the Prime Minister. Believe it or not, 10 Downing Street has sent their very best wishes and hope everyone enjoys their evening. He could not attend, though. Finally, he had other business to attend to. Finally, our founder, Marcel Arsenault, and his wife sends our their greetings. He hoped that he could be here today, but there was something else that came up. But he sent the following note. As members of the Giving Pledge, our foundations are endowed with at least 500 million and hopefully up to 1 billion US dollars. A major focus will be to reduce the existential threats of nuclear weapons. It was humans that released the nuclear genie on Japan. We must hope and pray that humans now possess the intelligence to tame this genie and to ensure that these horrific weapons are never used again. And I fully agree with Marcel on that. Finally, I need to thank Abby's son, who has driven this relentlessly over the last month, and thank you for your incredible work to bring us together. So I guess that is it. Thank you again, panelists. The moment is here. Let's enjoy his latest film.